1. Imelda Marcos. She was once called the steel butterfly. Graceful, glamorous, and untouchable. Imelda Marcos, the former First Lady of the Philippines, rose from provincial poverty to global luxury. With her husband Ferdinand Marcos ruling the nation for over 2 decades, Imelda became an international icon of power and prestige. She wore diamonds to dinner, traveled with an entourage larger than most heads of state, and reportedly amassed over 3,000 pairs of designer shoes, the ultimate symbol of opulence. But behind the wealth was something far more sinister. One of the most notorious corruption scandals in political history. While millions of Filipinos struggled under martial law and economic collapse, the Marcos regime was accused of looting an estimated $5 to $10 billion from public funds. Imelda, often seen on shopping sprees in New York and Rome, became the face of that excess. She bought art by Michelangelo, skyscrapers in Manhattan, and even attempted to purchase entire islands. It wasn't just luxury. It was a global real estate empire, funded by taxpayer money. After the Marcoses were ousted in 1986 by a people-powered revolution, Imelda fled to Hawaii. But the past wasn't done with her. In 1991, she returned to the Philippines and faced dozens of charges related to graft, tax evasion, and embezzlement. For years, she maintained her innocence, appearing in court dressed in high-fashion outfits and pearls. She even served as a congresswoman in her later years. A shocking return to politics for a woman accused of plundering a nation. But justice did arrive. In 2018, at age 89, Imelda Marcos was convicted of 7 counts of graft for funneling government funds into Swiss bank accounts while in public office. She was sentenced to 6 to 11 years per count, totaling 42 to 77 years in prison. Due to her age and political connections, she avoided immediate incarceration, but the conviction stood. For the first time, the queen of high society was legally exposed. Her fall was not dramatic, it was slow, calculated, and legal. And that's what made it so powerful. Imelda's story isn't just about greed or fashion. It's about how image can mask impunity, about how far someone can rise and still fall when truth comes knocking. 2. Ghislaine Maxwell. She was born into wealth, educated at Oxford, and once floated through elite circles in London, New York, and Paris. Ghislaine Maxwell, daughter of disgraced media tycoon Robert Maxwell, was known for her charm, intellect, and connections to presidents, royals, and billionaires. But beneath the polished exterior was a world of secrets that would eventually shatter her high society image and land her behind bars. In the 1990s, after her father's mysterious death and the collapse of his business empire, Ghislaine relocated to the United States and soon became closely associated with Jeffrey Epstein, a wealthy financier with a dark reputation. She wasn't just his girlfriend. According to multiple victims and federal prosecutors, she was the recruiter, the enabler, and the gatekeeper of his criminal network. Together, they lured vulnerable underage girls with promises of money, mentorship, or career opportunities, only to be exploited behind the walls of Epstein's mansions. For years, whispers circulated in elite social circles. Photos emerged of Ghislaine at royal events, on private yachts, and at the most exclusive galas. She appeared untouchable, a woman of status above scrutiny. But as Epstein's crimes came to light, especially after his 2019 arrest and subsequent death in custody, the spotlight turned directly onto her. In 2020, the illusion shattered. Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested by the FBI at a secluded New Hampshire estate and charged with multiple federal crimes, including sex trafficking of a minor, conspiracy, and perjury. Prosecutors described her role as calculated and cruel, grooming young girls, normalizing abuse, and participating in the system herself. The trial, held in 2021, was one of the most closely watched in recent memory. Witnesses testified to years of manipulation and horror, painting a stark picture of how privilege can protect predators. Maxwell denied all allegations, claiming she was being scapegoated for Epstein's crimes. But the jury disagreed. On December 29, 2021, Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted on 5 federal charges, including sex trafficking and conspiracy. In June 2022, she was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, a stunning fall for a woman once seen as royalty among the global elite. Her story is not just about crime. It's about how the mask of wealth and connections can be used to hide predatory systems, how charm can be a weapon, and how even the highest towers of privilege can crumble when truth and survivors rise up. 3. Dina Thompson. She was polished, poised, and utterly lethal. Dina Thompson presented herself as a woman of class, refined, confident, and dependable. To her victims, she seemed like a dream partner, intelligent, charming, financially stable. But behind her soft-spoken voice and designer wardrobe was a ruthless manipulator known to the media as the Black Widow. Born in the UK in 1960, Thompson made her way through life by lying, seducing, and scheming. Her weapon of choice wasn't a knife or gun, it was trust. She married 3 times, but only one of her husbands survived the relationship unharmed. The other, Julian Webb, was found dead in the bath after a dose of a fatal antidepressant. At first, the death seemed like suicide, but something didn't sit right. Digging deeper, investigators discovered a pattern. Thompson had been involved in over a dozen fraudulent financial schemes. She used fake names and documents to drain bank accounts, take out false loans, and cash in on insurance. Her marriages were business transactions masked as love stories, each one leaving her richer and her victims ruined. The unraveling of her empire began in 2000, when her third husband barely escaped a bizarre and violent episode. Dina had tied him to a bed under the pretense of intimacy, then beat him with a baseball bat and attempted to stab him. He managed to escape and alert the authorities. It was only then that police began connecting the dots between her different aliases, dead husbands, and financial scams. In 2003, Thompson was convicted of fraud, deception, and the murder of Julian Webb. During the trial, it emerged that she'd stolen over £200,000 through various cons. But the most chilling detail was her psychological profile. She was labeled a compulsive liar, a pathological narcissist, and someone capable of extreme cruelty cloaked in charm. In court, she showed little emotion, no tears, no apology, just a cold stare that betrayed years of manipulation. The judge called her the most dangerous woman he had ever sentenced. She received life in prison, where she remains to this day. But what made Dina Thompson's case so chilling wasn't just her crimes. It was how close she got to each victim. She didn't kill from a distance. She smiled at them, married them, laughed with them, and then took everything, including their lives. Number 4. Janine Jones. She was supposed to save lives. Instead, she took them, one injection at a time. Janine Jones wore the white uniform of trust, working as a pediatric nurse in Texas throughout the late 1970s and early 80s. To worried parents, she appeared compassionate, always near the most vulnerable patients. But behind that caring exterior was something far more sinister. Janine worked in hospital pediatric units, where an unusually high number of babies and young children began dying under mysterious circumstances. Often these children would crash suddenly, stop breathing, had seizures, or went into cardiac arrest, despite no prior warning signs. And the one common factor? Janine was always nearby. Some staff raised concerns, noting the spike in emergencies when she was on duty. But in an effort to avoid scandal or lawsuits, hospital administrators quietly encouraged her to resign rather than investigate her. She left one hospital and was promptly hired by another pediatric clinic. The pattern followed her. Children continued to suffer unexplained medical crises in her care. By then, the whispers grew louder. The press began calling her the Angel of Death. In 1984, the truth finally caught up. Janine was charged with the murder of 15-month-old Chelsea McClellan, who died after a lethal injection of a muscle relaxant during a routine clinic visit. Prosecutors believed her motive wasn't just control, but the need to be seen as a hero. They argued that Janine intentionally harmed children so she could be the first to respond, saving them and earning admiration in the process. But in Chelsea's case, there was no saving. The courtroom was stunned by the calculated cruelty hidden beneath a nurse's smile. Evidence showed that Janine kept syringes filled with dangerous drugs and even created fake codes to justify her treatments. She was convicted of murder and injury to a child, receiving a 99-year sentence plus an additional 60 years. For decades, Janine remained behind bars. But in a shocking twist, she became eligible for early release due to outdated parole laws in Texas. Public outcry erupted. To prevent her release, prosecutors reopened several cold cases tied to her and brought fresh charges. In 2020, she finally pleaded guilty to the murder of 11 more infants. This time, she received a life sentence with no possibility of parole. She now spends her final years in a Texas prison, no longer a nurse, no longer admired, and no longer able to play God. Number 5. Kathy Wood and Gwendolyn Graham. They were supposed to be caregivers. Instead, they formed one of the most twisted alliances in criminal history. Kathy Wood and Gwendolyn Graham weren't just co-workers at the Alpine Manor nursing home in Michigan. They were lovers. And together, they orchestrated a series of murders that would horrify the nation. In the mid-1980s, the two women worked the night shift, tending to elderly and vulnerable residents. But behind the scenes, their relationship took a dark turn. According to Kathy Wood, what started as flirtation turned into manipulation. She claimed that Gwendolyn Graham derived a sadistic thrill from killing, and that she played along to keep her lover's attention. Victims were often elderly women, some with dementia, and others who were physically fragile. They were suffocated, usually with washcloths or pillows, after being carefully selected. Wood later confessed that they chose victims who wouldn't be missed, whose deaths would be chalked up to natural causes. After each killing, they celebrated like it was an inside joke, even keeping a murder scorecard to track the deaths. The authorities were initially oblivious. In a nursing home filled with sick and elderly patients, death was an expected occurrence. But years later, after their relationship soured, Kathy Wood came forward with a full confession, claiming that Graham was the main killer and that she had merely watched or assisted out of fear and love. The courts saw it differently. Kathy Wood struck a plea deal and received a reduced sentence in exchange for her testimony against Graham. Gwendolyn Graham, who denied all involvement, was convicted of 5 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kathy Wood, on the other hand, was sentenced to 20 to 40 years. Despite her role in the murders, she became eligible for parole and was shockingly released in 2020, sparking widespread public outrage. What made the case so chilling wasn't just the betrayal of trust, it was the bizarre psychology behind it. This wasn't about money or revenge, it was about domination, manipulation, and the pleasure of power. And all of it happened in a place meant to be safe for the most defenseless members of society. Today, Gwendolyn Graham remains behind bars, serving out her life sentence in a Michigan prison. Kathy Wood walks free, her crimes etched into the memory of a nation that will never forget the night shift murder pact forged inside a care home. 6. Nanny Doss. She looked like the sweet old lady next door, the kind who baked pies, loved gardening, and always wore a smile. But behind that warm, grandmotherly exterior was a serial killer. Her name was Nanny Doss. The press would later nickname her the Giggling Granny, and her story remains one of the most bizarre in American criminal history. Born in 1905 in Alabama, Nanny's early life was riddled with hardship and abuse. Her father was controlling, her education limited, and her escape came through marriage at just 16. But instead of freedom, her adult life became a twisted trail of deception, charm, and murder. Over the course of decades, Nanny moved from one husband to another, always smiling, always polite, and almost always collecting life insurance after their sudden, mysterious deaths. Her methods were quiet and undetectable. Arsenic in coffee, poison in stew, rat poison stirred into pie. She never raised suspicion. Why would she? She was just a doting wife or grieving widow. But her victims weren't limited to spouses. Nanny's deadly reach extended to her mother, her sisters, her grandchildren, even her own mother-in-law. She slipped seamlessly into roles of care and affection, while quietly eliminating those who inconvenienced her. And she did it all with a sense of humor that would make your skin crawl. It wasn't until 1954 that her decades-long killing spree unraveled. Her 5th husband, Samuel Doss, had been admitted to the hospital with severe flu-like symptoms but survived. After he recovered and returned home, he suddenly died. This time, the doctor was suspicious and demanded an autopsy. The results revealed arsenic. Nanny was arrested shortly after, and her confession stunned the world. In a shocking twist, she laughed while telling detectives how she killed. She giggled through interviews, sipped coffee while recounting details, and posed for press photos as if she were a celebrity. She even joked, "My conscience doesn't bother me a bit." When asked why she committed so many murders, her answer was chillingly simple. She was bored, or her victims annoyed her. Authorities believe Nanny was responsible for at least 11 confirmed deaths, though some suspect the number could be higher. She was convicted in 1955 and sentenced to life in prison. She died in 1965 of leukemia, having spent her final years behind bars, still smiling, still giggling. To this day, Nanny Doss stands as a haunting reminder that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it comes wrapped in floral dresses, warm hugs, and cheerful laughter. The kind that sends a chill down your spine once you know the truth. 7. Sarah Jo Pender. Sarah Jo Pender didn't look like a killer. With high grades, a bright future, and the charm of someone born to succeed, she was the last person anyone expected to see on the FBI's most wanted list. But in 2002, that's exactly where she ended up. After masterminding a brutal double homicide and pulling off one of the most daring prison escapes in modern history. Born in 1979 in Indiana, Sarah was a straight-A student. She studied at Purdue University, held steady jobs, and was widely described as polite and intelligent. But beneath the surface, there was a different story. She fell in love with Richard Hull, an ex-con with a violent temper, and moved in with him and 2 roommates. What started as a turbulent love story ended in bloodshed. One October morning in 2000, police were called to the Indianapolis home Sarah shared with Hull and the roommates. Inside, they found the bodies of Andrew Cataldi and Tricia Nordman, shot execution-style and stuffed in a dumpster. The killings were cold and calculated. Richard Hull pulled the trigger, but prosecutors said Sarah was the puppet master. She bought the murder weapon, encouraged the plan, and helped cover it up. During her trial, Sarah claimed she was manipulated and abused by Hull, but the jury wasn't convinced. In 2002, she was sentenced to 110 years in prison for her role in the murders. Most thought her story would end there. But Sarah had other plans. In 2008, after just 6 years behind bars, Sarah Jo Pender escaped from the Rockville Correctional Facility with the help of a prison guard who had fallen in love with her. The plan was meticulous. Sarah crafted a fake release document, manipulated her allies inside, and walked out the front door in broad daylight, disappearing without a trace. For 136 days, she evaded capture. She dyed her hair, changed her name, and blended into life in Chicago, where she worked as a personal trainer. She charmed her way through every encounter. The FBI launched a nationwide manhunt, and America's Most Wanted aired her story multiple times. It wasn't until a tipster recognized her from the show that agents finally closed in. When she was arrested, Sarah didn't run. She smiled politely, spoke calmly, and seemed almost relieved. Her escape earned her a second conviction and added 20 more years to her already lengthy sentence. But it also cemented her legacy as the intelligent, manipulative, and dangerously persuasive woman who outsmarted the system, even if just for a while. Sarah Jo Pender remains in prison today. Some still believe she was a victim of her lover's influence. Others say she orchestrated every step, driven not by fear, but by control. 8. Mariam Sulakiotis. She was called Mother Mariam. To the outside world, she was a devoted Orthodox nun, pious, gentle, and revered for leading a secluded monastic order in the Greek mountains. But inside her walled sanctuary, something far more sinister was unfolding. By the time authorities intervened, Mariam Sulakiotis would be exposed as the leader of one of Greece's most disturbing religious cults, responsible for death, torture, and systematic abuse, cloaked in the language of salvation. Born in 1897, Mariam Sulakiotis claimed divine visions from a young age. She gained early attention from spiritual leaders and eventually established her own monastery, the Monastery of Calagresa, which quickly grew in popularity among wealthy women seeking spiritual guidance. Over the years, she cultivated a powerful following, especially among upper-class widows and vulnerable believers desperate for peace. But those who entered her domain rarely came out unchanged. By the 1950s, whispers began circulating, whispers of coercion, isolation, and vanishing women. Survivors eventually revealed the chilling truth. Mariam enforced brutal rules within the monastery. Nuns were starved, beaten, locked in isolation, and forced into submission under the guise of purification. But it didn't stop there. Wealthy followers were pressured to donate their estates, pensions, and properties to the monastery. Some who resisted were punished harshly. At least 8 women were confirmed to have died under suspicious conditions inside the compound. Autopsies later revealed signs of starvation, untreated illness, and prolonged physical abuse. The facade began to crack when one former follower escaped and reported what she'd witnessed to the authorities. Investigators raided the monastery in 1950, and what they found stunned the nation. Malnourished women locked in filthy rooms, diaries of torment, legal documents transferring fortunes to the cult, and behind it all, the aging figure of Mariam Sulakiotis, still dressed in religious robes, still claiming she was chosen by God. She was arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud, manslaughter, and torture. In 1952, she was sentenced to 26 years in prison. Despite the overwhelming evidence, many of her loyal followers continued to support her, insisting she had been framed by enemies of the church. They saw her not as a criminal, but as a martyr. Mariam died in prison in 1954, still insisting she was innocent. Her legacy remains one of the darkest chapters in Greek religious history, a chilling reminder of how power, when wrapped in spiritual authority, can be used to enslave instead of save. She didn't need a weapon. She didn't wear a mask. Her power came from the faith others placed in her, and she used it to destroy them from the inside out. 9. Marquise de Brinvilliers. She was born into nobility, raised among chandeliers, silk gowns, and whispers of courtly intrigue. But behind the delicate fan and powdered smile of the Marquise de Brinvilliers was a mind as lethal as any dagger. Her name would become synonymous with poison, scandal, and betrayal, and her crimes would shake the foundations of 17th-century France. Marie-Madeleine d'Aubray, the Marquise de Brinvilliers, lived a life of status and luxury. Daughter of a high-ranking official and wife to a prominent nobleman, she had access to wealth, influence, and the inner circles of Louis XIV's court. But she wanted more. More freedom, more money, and in time, less of her family. She began an affair with a man named Gaudin de Sainte-Croix, a former army officer and fellow aristocrat who introduced her to the dark art of poisoning. Under his tutelage, she began experimenting with toxins, testing them on the sick, the poor, even hospital patients. But her real plan was more personal. She wanted to eliminate those closest to her who stood in her way. One by one, her family members began to fall ill. Her father, her 2 brothers, all dead. And each death was ruled natural, until Sainte-Croix himself suddenly died in 1672. Among his possessions, authorities discovered incriminating letters and a box of poison, along with a written confession detailing the plot he and the Marquise had carried out together. It was a scandal of seismic proportions. A noblewoman poisoning her own bloodline for inheritance? The court couldn't ignore it. The Marquise fled France, but was eventually captured in Liège, tortured, and brought back for trial. She confessed under duress, and her admission shocked the public, confirming what many had whispered, that evil could wear a corset and sit at the king's table. Her punishment was as brutal as her crimes. On July 17, 1676, she was publicly beheaded and her body burned. The execution drew a massive crowd, nobles, peasants, and clergy, all eager to witness the fall of a woman who had turned poison into power. Her case sparked widespread fear of secret killings and led to one of the largest purges of suspected poisoners in French history, the infamous Affair of the Poisons. What made the Marquise so terrifying wasn't just what she did, but who she was. She wasn't a rogue outsider. She wasn't desperate or cornered. She was a woman of wealth, education, and privilege who looked at those closest to her and saw obstacles to be erased with a drop of arsenic. She didn't need a sword, just a teacup. 10. Lalla Batul Benessa. In the palaces of Morocco, she lived a life of wealth and privilege. Lalla Batul Benessa was no ordinary woman. She was a figure of royalty. Married to a powerful provincial governor under King Hassan II, she walked among Morocco's elite with grace, dignity, and political influence. But behind the curtains of luxury, her world was unraveling. And soon, she would go from silk robes to a prison uniform. Her husband, Si Ben Issa, was the governor of Essaouira, a key city on Morocco's Atlantic coast. The couple were among the most powerful in the region, and their family's reputation extended to royal circles. But when political tides shifted in the late 1970s and early 1980s, a storm was brewing. Morocco was gripped by unrest, and the regime of King Hassan II was cracking down hard on dissent, both real and perceived. When Lala Batul's husband was suddenly removed from power and arrested during a wave of political purges, the walls began to close in. Accused of involvement in political corruption and opposition activity, he was imprisoned and tortured. And then, shockingly, so was she. Despite little to no evidence, Lala Batul was arrested and thrown into Derb Moulay Sharif, a secret detention center in Casablanca notorious for its brutal conditions. She spent more than a decade imprisoned without formal trial, enduring physical and psychological abuse, her name erased from the public eye. The same woman who once dined with dignitaries now slept on concrete floors, surviving on scraps and silence. Her case became emblematic of a darker era in Morocco, what historians now call the Years of Lead. It was a time when political repression was swift, secret, and merciless. And Lala Batul's fall from grace wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a warning. After international pressure mounted and Morocco began to reckon with its past, she was quietly released in the early 1990s. But by then, the damage was done. The titles, the honor, the security, gone. She had been royalty, a wife of influence, a woman of the inner court. And yet, in the eyes of the regime, that meant nothing when the winds of power shifted. Lala Batul Benessa may not have committed a crime in the traditional sense. She wasn't a killer. She didn't steal, poison, or manipulate her way to the top. But her story shows another side of the fall from grace, when politics turns royalty into a prisoner, and silence becomes the loudest sentence of all. They had names that opened doors. They wore titles that once commanded respect: First Lady, Nurse, Heiress, Governor's Wife. They hosted dinner parties, held public trust, and posed for cameras in pearls and silk. But status, as it turns out, doesn't make you immune to consequence. In fact, sometimes it blinds people into thinking they'll never be caught. Each of these women stood at the peak of social privilege until their own actions, or the systems they were part of, pulled them into the shadows. Some used their status as a weapon, poisoning husbands, silencing rivals, or manipulating the vulnerable behind a mask of charm. Others were caught in political storms, punished not for what they did, but for who they were married to. Either way, the prison gates didn't care who they used to be. Power doesn't always corrupt, but when it does, it can wrap itself in grace, intelligence, and elegance. It can look like a philanthropist or a nun, a loving wife or a grieving mother. And when that illusion shatters, we're reminded of a hard truth: appearances don't protect you, and privilege can't plead innocence. So, here's the question. When the title is stripped away, what's left behind? Was there one case that shocked you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story eye-opening, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime cases that expose the dark side of power and privilege.